It was the week before Christmas, 2015. A brutal December cold had settled over the Colorado Rockies, the kind that seeps into your bones and chills you from the inside out. My younger sister, Chloe, and I were braving the elements, driving home for the holidays, our trusty Honda Civic a small, vulnerable vessel against the vast, unforgiving landscape. The radio had been warning of an impending blizzard for hours, and as twilight painted the sky in hues of gray and white, the first snowflakes began to fall. By nightfall, the snow was coming down thick and fast, transforming the highway into a treacherous, white labyrinth. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, the world outside the car a swirling vortex of white. Our initial excitement for Christmas carols and family gatherings had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that tightened its grip with every passing mile. We had planned to stop for the night at a little place called the Blue Spruce Inn, a solitary outpost of civilization that we'd spotted on our tattered road map, promising respite just off exit 243. It was our only hope in this blinding white wilderness. As we crept along, our headlights barely piercing the swirling snow, a shape emerged from the whiteness ahead, a lone figure, standing in the middle of the road, as if oblivious to the blizzard raging around him. He stood unmoving, a dark silhouette against the blinding white canvas. Chloe slowed the car to a crawl, her breath catching in her throat. "What in the world?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mournful howl of the wind. "Is he okay?" The man was dressed in a dark, heavy jacket and jeans, his back to us, a solitary sentinel in the heart of the storm. He seemed utterly out of place, like a character who had wandered onto the wrong stage. I rolled down the window a fraction, the icy wind instantly biting at my exposed skin. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the immensity of the storm. "Hey, you need help? Are you stuck?" The figure slowly turned around. It was a deliberate, almost mechanical movement that sent a shiver of unease down my spine. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, his features obscured by the swirling snow and the dim light. But his eyes were what I saw most clearly. Dark, intense, they seemed to bore into me, holding a depth of unsettling emotion that I couldn't quite decipher. He started to walk towards the car, his steps slow and measured, his gaze unwavering. There was a strange stiffness to his movements, as if he were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. A sense of dread, cold and heavy, settled in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't right. Something about this man, his presence, his demeanor, set off every alarm bell in my mind. It wasn't the look of someone stranded, someone in need of help. It was something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He reached the car, his face now close to the window, those intense eyes boring into mine. I instinctively recoiled, pressing myself back against the seat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then, with a suddenness that made me jump, his expression changed. A flicker of something wild, something feral, crossed his features. He lunged at the window, his gloved hand grabbing my collar through the small opening. "Are you going?" he rasped, his voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the confined space of the car. "Do you want to go? Do you want to go? Go over. Go over." His grip tightened, and he started shaking me, his other hand pounding on the car, a series of heavy thuds that echoed through the vehicle. Chloe screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound that was quickly swallowed by the wind. We were trapped, frozen in a tableau of terror, unable to react, unable to comprehend the sudden explosion of violence. It was like a scene from a nightmare, unfolding with a terrifying slowness. Then, out of the swirling white, two figures emerged. They were large men, clad in heavy work clothes, their faces weathered and grim. Lumberjacks, returning from a day's work in the forest, their truck parked just off the road, hidden by the snow. They had seen what was happening. With shouts of rage, they rushed towards us, their heavy boots crunching on the snow-covered road. They grabbed the man, their strong hands tearing him away from me, breaking his grip on my collar. They wrestled him back, cursing, their voices raw with fury, their words lost in the wind. The man struggled for a moment, his eyes still locked on mine. Then he seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of him. He stumbled back, his gaze finally breaking, and then he turned and vanished into the blizzard, disappearing into the white void as quickly as he had appeared. The lumberjacks, their faces etched with concern, checked on us, their gruff voices offering words of comfort. They told us the man was known in these parts, a troubled soul named Silas, with a history of mental illness. He lived a solitary life, mostly harmless, but prone to these occasional, unpredictable episodes. It was a tragic explanation, but it did little to erase the terror of those few minutes, the chilling image of Silas's face, his crazed eyes, his desperate, guttural pleas. We thanked the lumberjacks, our voices trembling, and continued our drive, the encounter leaving us shaken and raw. The faint glow of the blue spruce and finally appeared through the swirling snow, a beacon of hope in the desolate landscape. Relief, however, was short-lived. The motel was a dilapidated, two-story structure, its paint peeling, its neon sign flickering erratically, casting long, distorted shadows in the snow. The parking lot was empty, save for a thick layer of undisturbed snow. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, a relic from a bygone era. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with the swirling snow outside. The air was thick with the scent of dust, stale cigarette smoke, and something else, something indefinably unsettling, like the lingering odor of decay. There was no one at the reception desk. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind and the creaking of the old building. On the counter, a single, handwritten note lay under a dusty ashtray. Its message was stark, chilling in its simplicity. "Go now." The words seemed to pulsate in the dim light, a silent scream in the oppressive silence. A wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over me, a primal terror that bypassed all logic and reason. Chloe's hand found mine, her grip tight and desperate. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The same thought echoed in our minds, a shared understanding born of a shared fear. The encounter on the road, the desolate motel, the cryptic note, it all pointed to something deeply wrong, something sinister lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly abandoned place. This wasn't a haven. It was a trap. Without a word, we turned and fled, back out into the storm, back into the blinding white. We got back into the car, our hearts pounding, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Chloe started the engine, the familiar rumble a small comfort in the terrifying uncertainty. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far away from exit 243, far away from the Blue Spruce Inn and the chilling message that awaited us there. We drove until the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, chasing away the shadows of the night. We never spoke about that night in detail, not to each other, not to anyone. It became a silent pact, a shared secret that we both tried to bury. But the memory lingered, a dark stain on the pristine white canvas of that winter. It was February 2017, the dead of winter, when I decided to join my cousin Liam at his family's remote cabin in northern Wisconsin. He'd been going up there for years, especially during hunting season, and swore there was no better place to unplug. I didn't exactly share his enthusiasm for isolation, but the timing seemed right. I'd just quit my job and needed a break from city life. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest gas station. By the time I arrived, the snowstorm that had been predicted for the next morning seemed to be rolling in early. The sky was a thick gray blanket, and the wind carried an icy bite as I lugged my bags inside. Liam greeted me with a beer and one of his usual sarcastic remarks. "Welcome to paradise," he said, gesturing to the modest living room. A hunting rifle hung above the fireplace, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the wooden walls. It was cozy, in a rugged sort of way. We spent the evening catching up over dinner, the wind picking up outside. By 10 p.m., the snow was coming down hard, hammering against the windows. We huddled on the couch, watching a wildlife documentary on Liam's laptop. The sound of the storm outside made it feel like we were the only two people left in the world. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like boots on snow. At first, I thought it was part of the video. I glanced at Liam, but he hadn't noticed. The sound came again, louder this time, deliberate. I muted the laptop. "What's up?" Liam asked, frowning. "Did you hear that?" He paused, tilting his head. The sound came again, from just outside the cabin. Crunch, crunch. It wasn't random, like falling branches or shifting ice. It was measured, human. "Could be a deer," Liam said, but he didn't look convinced. His hand drifted toward the hunting knife on the counter, and he gripped it tightly. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved toward the window, my pulse quickening. The beam barely cut through the swirling snow, revealing only the vague outline of the trees. My breath fogged the glass as I strained to see anything, anyone, out there. "Who's out there?" Liam called, his voice firm but tinged with unease. The wind answered with a mournful howl. The crunching stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the storm raging outside. I turned to Liam, my nerves settling slightly. Maybe it was just a branch falling in the snow, or an animal passing through. Then, the sound came again, this time from the back of the cabin, the distinct rattle of the doorknob. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Liam shot me a look, his eyes wide but focused. "Stay here," he whispered. "No way," I said, grabbing a fire poker from the hearth. We moved together toward the back door, every step heavy with dread. Liam held his knife out in front of him, his jaw clenched. The rattle came again, softer now, almost teasing. Liam flung the door open, and the freezing air hit us like a slap. The snow was pristine, except for a set of boot prints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. We stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam darting between the trees. The storm swallowed everything, making the forest seem endless. Liam finally shut the door, locking it this time. "Think it's just some hiker who got lost?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. "In this storm? Doubt it," Liam muttered. He glanced at the rifle above the fireplace, but neither of us moved to grab it. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. We didn't sleep, keeping watch over the cabin as the storm howled outside. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made us jump. By morning, the snow had buried the footprints, erasing all evidence of our midnight visitor. We left the cabin that afternoon, cutting the trip short. Neither of us ever went back. To this day, I wonder who, or what, was out there in the blizzard, and why they came so close. It was the winter of my junior year, a year that began like countless others, but would carve itself into my memory with a chilling precision. My best friend, Alex, and I, fueled by a potent cocktail of teenage bravado and a yearning for freedom, had somehow convinced our parents to let us rent a secluded house in the Catskill Mountains for a long weekend. Our plan was simple: snowboarding, copious amounts of junk food, and a healthy dose of the kind of unsupervised shenanigans that only seem appealing when you're 17. The house we found was a time capsule from the 1970s, a sprawling A-frame nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town of Havenwood, its isolation a significant part of its charm. It was the kind of place that whispered stories of its past, with its shag carpets, wood paneling, and the faint, lingering scent of pine needles and wood smoke. A blizzard, fierce and unforgiving, descended upon us early Friday evening, the wind howling like a banshee, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors in thick, heavy drifts. By nightfall, the power lines, groaning under the weight of ice and snow, finally gave way, plunging us into a darkness so profound it felt almost tangible. Unfazed, or perhaps fueled by a youthful sense of adventure, we lit a collection of mismatched candles we found in a kitchen drawer. Their flickering flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar surroundings into a constantly shifting landscape of light and darkness. We settled in for a night of card games, the silence punctuated only by the crackling of the fire we'd managed to coax to life in the stone fireplace and the mournful wail of the wind outside. Around midnight, During a lull in our game of poker, I decided to brave the chill and fetch more matches from the kitchen. As I walked past the darkened kitchen, a subtle anomaly caught my eye. The basement door, usually latched shut, a barrier against the damp and the unsettling stillness of the unfinished space below, was slightly ajar. "Alex," I called out, my voice a little louder than necessary, an attempt to mask the sudden unease that had settled over me. "Did you open this? The basement door?" He looked up from his cards, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No, man. Why would I? You know I hate going down there." He was right. Alex had always been a little squeamish about basements, especially in old houses. I pushed the door open a few more inches. A wave of cold, damp air washed over me, carrying with it the musty scent of earth and something else, something faintly metallic, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's open," I said, the words barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something unseen. A sense of unease, subtle at first, then steadily growing, began to creep into my awareness. It was like a sixth sense, a primal instinct warning me that something was not quite right. We rarely ventured into the basement. It was an unfinished space, with a low ceiling, a dirt floor, and walls made of rough, gray stone. It was used mostly for storage, and had always held a vaguely oppressive atmosphere that discouraged exploration. As I turned to head back to the living room, a sound drifted up from the darkness below, a faint, rhythmic clang, like metal on metal, followed by a soft, rustling sound, like footsteps on dirt or gravel. My curiosity, that persistent inner voice that had led me into trouble more times than I could count, urged me forward. I took a tentative step towards the open doorway, then another. The sounds from below were clearer now, more distinct. The clang repeated, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of someone moving around down there. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it. A faint, flickering light, like a candle flame, emanating from somewhere deep within the basement. It danced and swayed, casting long, distorted shadows on the stone walls. A jolt of fear, sharp and visceral, pierced through my initial curiosity. It was a primal fear, the kind that bypasses logic and reason, triggering a deep-seated, instinctive response. We were supposed to be alone in the house. We hadn't lit any candles down there. So, who, or what, was in the basement? My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I was about to turn and run back to Alex, to the relative safety of the living room, when my foot caught on something. A discarded plastic water bottle, lying forgotten on the floor. It made a loud, crinkling sound as I stepped on it, an amplified noise in the stillness of the house. The sounds from the basement stopped abruptly. The flickering light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. Then, a new sound began. Footsteps, coming closer, moving faster now, ascending the stairs with an unnerving speed. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized me. I stumbled back, away from the open doorway, my mind reeling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned and fled back to the living room, my legs pumping, my lungs burning. "Alex!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Someone's down there, in the basement." We slammed the basement door shut, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. I fumbled with the old, rusty lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the metal. Finally, with a click that sounded final, the lock engaged. But then came the silence. No pounding, no scratching, no desperate attempts to open the door. Just an unnerving, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. It was as if whoever had been down there had simply vanished, melting back into the shadows. We called the police, the act itself a strange juxtaposition in the candlelit room, the modern technology feeling out of place in the rustic setting. The local sheriff, a man named Hayes, arrived an hour later, his patrol car struggling up the snow-covered driveway, its flashing lights painting the swirling snow in hues of red and blue. Sheriff Hayes, a man whose demeanor seemed permanently etched with skepticism, listened to our story with a patient but ultimately unconvinced air. He ventured down into the basement, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He was down there for what felt like an eternity. When he finally re-emerged, his expression was grim, but not for the reasons we anticipated. The basement was empty, but there, at the far end, was a door we hadn't noticed before. A low wooden door, almost hidden in the shadows. It led to an old, disused root cellar, and beyond that, a narrow, dirt-floored passage that snaked its way to a concealed exit behind the house, hidden by a thick tangle of bushes. The door was wide open. The sheriff's search of the area yielded nothing. The blizzard had erased any footprints, any sign of the intruder's path. Whoever had been in the basement was gone, vanished into the storm without a trace. Weeks later, after we had returned to our regular lives, attempting to relegate the events in the Catskills to the realm of a bad dream, we received a call from Sheriff Hayes. He sounded different this time, his usual gruffness replaced by a hesitant, almost bewildered tone. Through a painstaking review of security footage from the few houses in Havenwood that had cameras, coupled with some old-fashioned detective work, they had identified a suspect. It was a young man named Caleb, a former resident of the house we had rented. He'd been evicted months earlier for failing to pay rent but had apparently discovered, or perhaps always known about, the hidden passage. He had been using it to secretly access the house, living in the shadows, a phantom tenant. Caleb was eventually apprehended, found living in a squalid shack a few miles outside of town. He was charged with trespassing, breaking and entering, and a string of other petty crimes. The story made the local papers, a minor sensation in the sleepy towns of the Catskills. But the official explanation, the neat resolution of the case, did little to quell the unease that had taken root in my soul. The image of that flickering candlelight in the darkness, the sound of those hurried footsteps, the chilling silence that followed. These things lingered, festering in my mind like a persistent infection. It was February 2015, and the kind of blizzard that hits Buffalo a few times a year. The kind that makes you question why anyone chooses to live there. My buddy, Dave, and I were out in it, though, trying to make some extra cash. We were going door to door, offering to shovel driveways, bundled up so thick we could barely move. Vision was limited to about 5 feet in front of your face thanks to the swirling snow and the way our breath froze on our goggles. We got a few no thanks and a couple of doors slammed in our faces. Then, as we were trudging down Barrington Street, a voice called out from one of the big, old Victorians that lined the block. This one was particularly imposing, with its dark, weathered wood and a turret that seemed to glare down at us through the snow. "You boys shoveling?" the voice asked. It was muffled by the wind and the closed door, but it sounded older, maybe a little rough around the edges. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. $20 a driveway." The door opened just a crack, maybe an inch or two. All I could see was a gloved hand holding out a crumpled $20 bill. No face, no other sign of the person inside. "Do the front, and I'll have the rest for you at the back door," the voice said. Dave and I exchanged a look. It was a little odd, sure, but $20 was $20, and we weren't exactly in a position to be picky. We got to work, the snow coming down so hard it felt like we were shoveling uphill. As I worked, I kept glancing back at the house. Every window was dark except for one on the second floor, and in that window, I could just make out a figure, standing perfectly still, watching us. It was creepy. The way the figure didn't move, didn't even seem to react to the blizzard raging outside. It was like something out of a movie, the silent observer in the darkened window, and it sent a little shiver down my spine. "You see that?" I asked Dave, nodding towards the window. He squinted, his goggles fogging up. "See what? The old dude watching us? Probably just making sure we don't slack off." "Yeah, maybe," I said, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. We finished up the front, the wind whipping at our faces, our muscles aching from the effort. As we rounded the house to the back, the voice called out again, this time from behind the closed back door. "Leave your shovels outside, boys," the voice instructed. "Come on in and warm up while I get the rest of your money." I saw Dave's eyes widen behind his goggles, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. This was wrong. Something about the way the voice sounded, the way the house felt, the figure in the window. It all added up to a bad feeling, a knot of dread in my stomach. The back door had a small, frosted glass window. As I peered through it, trying to see into the kitchen, a figure moved inside. It was just a silhouette, blurry through the frosted glass, but I could see that it was holding something. Something large and dark, and definitely not money. It looked like a hammer. My heart leaped into my throat. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get out of there. "Dave," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "We gotta go. Now." He didn't argue. He just turned and ran, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the block, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. We didn't talk much on the way back to my place, both of us still shaken by what had happened, or what we thought almost happened. We just huddled inside, trying to get warm, trying to forget the house on Barrington Street and the figure in the window. Then, later that night, we saw it on the news. A report about an arrest on Barrington Street. A man had been taken into custody for assaulting a teenager he lured into his house under the pretense of shoveling snow. The weapon, the news reporter said, was a hammer. The blood drained from my face. That could have been us. We could have been the ones in that news report, the victims of some sicko's twisted game. The police never released the man's name, and I never went back to Barrington Street. But I'll never forget that house, that voice, that figure in the window. The blizzard had descended upon our little town of White Pine Ridge, Wyoming, with the ferocity of a beast unleashed. It wasn't just snowing. It was a complete whiteout, the kind that swallowed houses whole and turned familiar streets into an alien landscape. I was 17 that year, 2019, and found myself holed up in my room, seeking refuge from the storm in the flickering glow of a rerun of The X-Files. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. Then came the sound, a soft thud against my window. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the wind whipping snow against the glass. But then it came again, a little more insistent this time, a little more deliberate. It had a rhythmic quality to it, like someone or something tapping. Curiosity, that age-old enemy of common sense, began to gnaw at me. I pulled back the curtain, peering out into the swirling white abyss. At first, I saw nothing, just the blinding snow dancing in the wind. Then, a figure materialized out of the whiteness, standing in my backyard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. The figure was bundled up in a thick, olive-green parka, a scarf wrapped around most of its face, leaving only the eyes visible. It was impossible to tell who it was, but my first thought was that it was probably just Michael or Chloe, my two best friends, playing a prank. They knew I was a sucker for anything spooky. I quickly grabbed my phone and texted them both. "Very funny, guys. You can come in now." The replies came back almost instantly. Michael was holed up at his grandma's, miles away, and Chloe swore she hadn't left her house all day. Both messages ended with a string of confused emojis. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. If it wasn't Michael or Chloe, then who was it? My curiosity, now tinged with a healthy dose of apprehension, got the better of me. I slid open my window just a crack, the frigid air instantly stinging my face. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely audible above the howling wind. The figure didn't answer, at least not with words. Instead, it raised a gloved hand and waved, a slow, almost mocking gesture. Then, it let out a muffled laugh, a sound that was both chilling and strangely familiar, though I couldn't place why. The sound was swallowed by the howling wind almost instantly, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined it. I quickly shut the window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As soon as the window clicked shut, the figure lunged, its gloved hands scrabbling at the glass, trying to pry it open again. Panic seized me, a cold wave washing over me. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers clumsy and unresponsive, finally managing to secure it just as the figure's hand slipped through the narrow opening. The figure vanished back into the storm as quickly as it had appeared. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. Who was that? And what did they want? I ran downstairs to the living room, where my dad, Robert, was engrossed in a book, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth. I told him what had happened, my voice shaking as I described the figure, the attempted break-in. He listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Probably just some kids playing a prank, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and reassuring, but utterly unconvinced. "The storm's probably driving everyone a little stir-crazy." He chuckled and went back to his book, dismissing the incident as harmless teenage fun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The way the figure moved, the muffled laugh, the intensity in those barely visible eyes. It all felt too deliberate, too menacing to be just a prank. Hours later, long after I'd given up trying to convince my dad, I was back in my room, trying to lose myself in the flickering images on the TV screen. But sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. Then, I heard it. The soft creak of my bedroom door opening. "Not now, Lily," I mumbled, thinking it was my younger sister coming in to bother me, as she often did. But the silhouette that stepped into the room was too tall, too broad to be Lily. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure stood there for a moment, a dark shape against the faint light from the hallway. The only sound the gentle tap-tap-tap of melting snow dripping from his boots onto the carpet. Then, he moved, with a speed that belied his bulky appearance. He lunged towards me, shoving me back onto the bed, a gloved hand clamping over my mouth, muffling my scream. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. I could smell the faint scent of pine and something else, something metallic, clinging to his coat. His eyes, the only part of his face visible, gleamed in the dim light, filled with a chilling intensity. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. My dad burst into the room, wielding the fire poker from the living room like a weapon. He roared, a primal sound of fury and fear, and the figure recoiled. He bolted out of the room, disappearing down the hallway, leaving a trail of wet footprints in his wake. We heard the back door slam, and then silence, broken only by the howling wind outside. It turned out he'd broken in through the basement window, using the blizzard as cover. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the swirling snow, but the figure was long gone. They eventually caught him a few streets over, hiding in a neighbor's shed. He was just a guy, a local with a history of petty theft and a disturbing fascination with breaking into houses during storms.